I'm talking about a concept called systemic alignment. And I think you can see some of the thinking around this concept of alignment coming out of the two very good presentations we've heard about the CFR itself and the project in Japan. So I'm pointing the direction of a CFRT, so downplaying the E and upgrading the R, the reference function of the CFR for alignment purposes across the educational landscape, and particularly in a landscape where specific policy goals and reforms have been outlined with a timeline for change. And I'm going to illustrate, I'll come back a little bit at the end of my talk to the presentation of Masashi, but also focus on the context of Italy, which was, I think, the first country in Europe to adopt the CFR for the purposes of a reform program. It was a program called the Progetto Lingue 2000, or the Language Project 2000, which was one which sought to align different components of a reform program, which included assessment, where assessment was seen as an important driver of the change process. Yeah, so there's my title, and this is the introduction I've just given. So if you go to the next slide, does it fit on there? It's the, you've got it in a PDF form there, I see.
Yeah.
The one
so you sent me the PDF.
The one previous to that one.
Okay.
So this is the what I'm talking about, which is the I'll outline the concept of systemic alignment that seeks to address the tensions that occur in English language reform programs between macro level policy making and micro level implementation of the policy. And we saw a little bit of that in Masashi's slides there when he was talking about how the policy translates down into classroom practices, so from the macro to the micro, if you like. Such tensions between macro and micro often lead to divergence between large-scale assessments and desirable classroom practices, such as the teaching and learning of spoken language, which is desirable in the Taiwanese context. And this impact of assessment is usually characterized as negative washback or negative impact. So a key element of the approach is the notion of systemic alignment. And this is so that you try and get the two coming together to avoid the divergence. This can be illustrated in cases where the CFR has been adapted to the local educational context. Assessment, as you'll see in the Japanese context and elsewhere, usually remains a long-term problem. So next slide. So systemic alignment and assessment, I would say that the challenge for us as assessment professionals is to link all types of assessment into a coherent model that values learning processes and learning outcomes. So ultimately, the aim is to bring about improved language teaching and learning, and to avoid those negative impacts where learning and assessment practices are divergent. And this comes under the heading more widely of what is often called learning-oriented assessment, or LOA. Next slide. So the systemic alignment, systemic approach brings together all segments of the educational landscape into alignment to meet the stated goals. So if you have stated goals like to improve teaching and learning of English and to raise proficiency standards, you have that as your goal. And then around the outside, you have to align all those segments, the curriculum, the learning materials, the assessment, which is designed to deliver positive impact, and the teacher development and support. Now, the CFR is helpful in this, in that it encompasses the high-level goals of learning, which is the community of competence, and helps in the other components, which includes the curricular objectives and the very central proficiency scale at the heart of it, which allows the progress to be visible. I would say the approach, though, as we've heard already, goes beyond the design of the assessment instruments and procedures themselves and encompasses the policy making, the educational reforms, and a change management timescale. And as we've heard, that can be quite extensive, as we saw in Japan over 20 years. So we're trying to put this together coherently, ultimately to equip the learners with the enhanced communication skills that are required by the policymakers and by society at large, including, I would say, parents and the learners themselves. And in order to do this, we have to make sure that in the policy and in the implementation, there's an increased focus on productive skills within the reform program, and especially the need to raise standards of spoken language proficiency. And that means to incorporate it into the assessment system somehow in an appropriate way. The next slide, please, Masashi. Just as background, to let you know that this concept taps into ecological systems theory. This kind of theory has had a long and far-reaching impact on education, and those who study the way that educational processes happen. And this is a model called, from Bronfenbrenner going back more than 40 years. And it sees education as a complex dynamical system with the interaction between these different, what he calls levels, with the learner very much at the center. And that's where it ties in with the thinking, as you've heard from Nails, about putting learners at the micro level at the center, and then making sure that the macro policies and so on converge to help the learning and the learner at the core. Next slide, please. So this is a model, a diagram I use because it's trying to link the learner to society. So what you're wanting to do in the classroom and in education, which is in that red oval with the school, what goes on in schools and the constructs of the tests and the curriculum, is to help change the learner in terms of her learning of the language and her growth across 12 years of schooling, in order to equip her as a social agent for participation in society. So to make sure what matters, communication in the real world, is embodied within the school system. And this goes beyond probably the school as the locus for learning and the locus for practicing languages. And this is very much at the heart of the CFR, which sees the learner as a social agent, and the need for us to create what is sometimes called language-friendly learning environments. At the heart of this model, of course, is the evidence needed to support learning and to show whether progress is being made. Now, very quickly, moving on to the next slide, we see I'm reiterating what we've heard from Naos, which is that we now have, over the past 20 years, many examples of people using this tool, the CFR, as a reference document, and I'm emphasizing the reference here. Next slide, please. Because it was very much, this is a quotation from the authors, designed from the initial days to provide a common basis. So the core needed for the elaboration of syllabus, curriculum, examinations, textbooks, and so on. Originally in Europe, but now, as we've heard, beyond. So moving on, please. So we've already heard that it's an evolutionary approach, that there are many tools in the toolbox, including the reference levels, the companion volume most recently, and the adaptations, which are good examples, and we've seen the one in Japan. Neo's mentioned a few. We also have one in Thailand, and also the impact is in South America and other parts of the world. So very wide toolkit and examples we can draw on. Next slide, please. And very much, I think, the agreement that the red at the bottom is that it provides us with shared practice, shared language, sharing of knowledge for harmonization within your own context, or the concept of alignment, as I'm calling it, adapted to meet local contextual needs and preferences. Therefore, it's by design an evolutionary approach which evolves in every context in which it's used, and that is now in the idea of a CEFR for Taiwan. And this next slide summarizes, I think, how I see it coming together, that we need the frame of reference, both in terms of the scales. So it's probably the very bottom end of the scale, again, in most parts of the world, the pre-A1 to the B1 needing to be adapted, because that's the context, then providing us with the high-level objectives of communication skills, the action-oriented approach, and therefore the necessary content, and that includes constructs for assessment, which play into the learning-oriented classroom, and then lead us to learning outcomes which are real competence, real ability to use the language in the world at large. And on the right here, we have the alignment of the large-scale exams to the curriculum objectives, and also what goes on in classrooms. So the more formative or the more embedded dimensions of assessment, which are assessment for learning or as learning, in ways which we now hear of in learning-oriented approaches. Next slide, please. So I haven't got time here to dwell on this, but here are some key features which I see as needed in aligning the macro and micro level in any context. And it's seeing very much the learner not simply as a pupil in a classroom, but the learner as somebody who is developing communication skills as part of personal development and in relation to personal interests, desires, and activities which motivate, which link the classroom activities to the future uses. And we need visible progress as part of this, so feedback on what progress is being made at a granular level, and that needs the adaptation of the 6 levels into the finer grained feedback of the kind that we saw in Masashi's talk. And at the heart of this, we need to see those mediating, interacting skills, and not simply the passive or the receptive skills of the past. Next slide, please. So where next for the CEFR in Taiwan? I think this could be a quick win, that if we can engage the various components of this macro level system into an agreement to develop a CEFR in Thailand, we can then see how it will play out into developing a policy which then feeds into the practice and pedagogy of teaching language in an action-oriented way. But we will need to see alignment, not simply of the exam with the textbook or the pedagogy in the classroom, but the whole attitude and approach to how we see communication skills being developed. And this is why alignment goes beyond the classroom or the ministry in a narrow sense. So the next slide shows that once we have a CFR-T, we can then work further on the shared understandings and the common purpose needed to move towards the goal of the learner as a social agent. With a plurilingual repertoire, so not ignoring other language skills, as we also heard from Masashi, but also on the right here, we must make sure that on the assessment side, we design the assessments to converge with the outcomes from the policy in order to make sure that if you are teaching and assessing interactive ability in the classroom, you also make sure that is the case in your higher stakes exams and certifications. So we make sure that we achieve through the assessments, which have a powerful washback effect, a positive impact by design. So moving on, case studies, two I've already mentioned. We come first to the CFR-J, move on to that, simply to say, yes, I believe that it was possible to achieve the goals over a long period, and this was about 3 years in when I took part in this. This is a quotation from the report of that Kaken or grant-funded seminar in 2007, where the idea of adapting the CFR to the Japanese context beyond simply adopting it was agreed. And I think you can see from Masashi's presentation that really worked very well over the long term through the engagement of many stakeholders across the educational and societal landscape, including the ministry people. And if you look at the next slide, the encouraging thing, this is a translation of the document from the ministry of their new national curriculum standards, which deliver the CFR into schools. So from across the grades 3 to the end of high school, with the CFR can-do model built in, increasingly with the 4 skills and the interactive communication as a goal. You'll see, as Masashi said, that the ambition is still modest because it only takes you to A2 B1 at the end of high school, which is B1 is a reasonable level. But one of the things I would note is that there isn't the number of hours needed to reach B1 may not be delivered through just the school curriculum itself. So connecting school to society was probably necessary, and a wider understanding of English as a communication tool and not a school subject. And the other thing I would say is that there's still a non-alignment of the high stakes exams that come at the end of high school for university entrance, which remain only in a 2-skill mode, and therefore we have a problem of lack of convergence between the goals of the curriculum in school and what's needed to get into university. The next example, I think, is a very good one to look at from the point of view of any reform program, because it was an early example. It dated back to the pre-publication actually of the CFR to 2000 with the Progetto Lingue 2000 in Italy. Italy doesn't have standardized exams. It's devolved. It's quite. It's quite a devolved system at a regional level with regional ministries and so on. And what the ministry is trying to do was to introduce a focus on communication skills, higher levels of communication across the levels. So to create a progression from elementary school to middle school and to high school, using the frame of reference to map progression into different types of school and for different purposes with a common language and a common way of recognizing proficiency. And in order to do so, they integrated policy goals with the materials, the methodology for teaching, the teacher support, and the testing. And they brought in certification, including certification provided by external bodies like Cambridge and other exam boards. And it was multilingual, so not just for English. This was a really interesting project. It's now been going for 20 years. And in some of the better regions, that's ones that have succeeded to implement it more effectively, we've seen increasing proficiency incrementally over 20 years, to the extent that they're now able to introduce into high school, at the end of high school, CLIL, which is content and language integrated lessons, in the final year of high school, where the actual curriculum subject is taught in English. And if you're interested, there's a lot of information about this project, several impact studies, and there are a number of very influential ministry inspectors who could be contacted to talk about their experience in doing this. I have many other examples. I've run out of time now, so thank you for your attention. Sorry about the delay at the start. Thank you, Masashi, for sharing your slides, and obviously in the follow-up I'd be happy to take questions about any of this. So thank you.